So it's my great pleasure to be interviewing you for the Norbert Elias Foundation website. Just to kick off, can you tell us a few details about yourself, about where you're from?
Yeah, I'm now pensioned, but I was a few years ago still a professor in Cultural Sociology at the University of Amsterdam. And actually, I was already a student in the University of Amsterdam in the 1960s, and then graduated there and got my PhD there. And then I became assistant professor, associate professor, and then finally full professor at the same university. So I was always in Amsterdam, but I was also for a year, for example, in the European University Institute in Florence, and guest professor in the University of Minneapolis. So I had a few foreign experience too. Yeah.
And was it always cultural studies?
No,
was it,
no. I consider myself actually as a sociologist, a general sociologist. So I was involved in different. I did research on different topics, different fields of sociology. There was a free position for cultural sociology at that moment. It was actually new. It was a new branch of sociology within the University of Amsterdam. And at first I became an associate professor in that, and it was very small, tiny, and then became gradually somewhat bigger, and then I could get the position of full professor in cultural sociology, because that was also my main teaching task, actually, to introduce students in cultural sociology.
What kind of empirical areas were you working on?
My PhD thesis was about developments in social inequality, more particularly economic inequality, and even more particularly the distribution of wealth. It was a study of long-term development from the 19th century of the distribution of wealth in the Netherlands, and then from a sociological perspective. So that was quite new. And I continued also studies in that field of inequality in income and wealth, also comparing different countries, then not only in the Netherlands, but from a comparative and historical perspective. That was one of the things I did.
And so that's quite interesting. So you were interested in what I would see as kind of economic sociology.
Yes, yeah.
And then your first few posts were around cultural sociology.
Yeah, that was somewhat unexpectedly.
Yeah.
I don't consider myself as a specialist, you know.
Yeah.
I did things in different fields, and I was always very much interested also in the theory of civilization, of the civilizing process of Norbert Elias, and I also wrote a few theoretical articles about that, so that you can say, well, that was cultural sociology, so to speak.
Well, tell me about that point. So when did you first encounter the work of Norbert Elias?
That was when I was a student. Before I encountered the work of Norbert Elias, I encountered Elias himself, namely when he was a guest professor at the University of Amsterdam, and I attended his lectures, and also I attended a seminar where he presented work on the sociology of knowledge. I was a student then, and then also I had a course in social psychology, and you could choose among different books, and then I thought, well, it's now time to read the book on the civilizing process, Über den Prozess der Zivilisation in German, the civilizing process. And that was, well, my first acquaintance of really the work of Elias. And that was also the moment that I thought, well, this is really very important. This is really something I really learned something from it. You know, I mean, in my study, I had several sociology books that I thought, well, interesting, but what did I really learn from that book? And this was a book which gave me really new insights actually basically in, let's say, the structure of social developments, you know, in a non-dogmatic, very empirical way. I mean, my whole image of a medieval society until then and history from that time was somewhat chaotic, actually.
Yeah.
I didn't really understand what happened, only a succession of battles and so on, and some nations who came up, and then struggles and revolutions. And, well, Elias gave me really an idea of how history is indeed structured.
Yeah.
That was very important, and of course also how political and also economic developments are intertwined with mental developments, psychological developments, and developments in everyday life, the changes in everyday life, how that all those different developments hang together.
So
that was fascinating. Yeah.
It was a module on social psychology. Did you say that he was
Yeah,
lecturing?
yeah.
So I can start to see now how these things start to link up. You know, you go from economic sociology to kind of the interface between social processes, psychological processes, and of course Elias's work is all encompassing, isn't it? It doesn't treat these as kind of separate domains.
Indeed, yes. So that was also a kind of lesson, although I always have perhaps conceived sociology also from other sociologists as a kind of generalizing social science, actually, in which I see that as essential to sociology, that one does not see that one sees always different social sectors as interrelated, as interconnected, and you can only comprehend, understand, let's say, economic relations by relating them to political relations, by cultural connections, and so on. So that is indeed most clearly explicated by Elias in his figurational approach, I would say.
It's interesting what you said, because it really struck a chord with me, that this idea that when you first encounter Elias's work, there's something different about it. And that you feel like you're learning something from it, that you're getting something from it in the way that you perhaps didn't get from some of these other positions. Could you elaborate a little bit more about that? Because that really struck a chord with me.
Yeah, that was particularly the case for me with the book on the civilizing process. Yeah. Because for me it gave all kinds of historical information. I mean, about. I mean, it's a book in which indeed empirical research and theory are completely intertwined. Actually, you cannot say here is the empirical description and there begins the theory. It's a fusion of both, you know. And in that whole book, he always goes from quite specific descriptions, examples of how the life of knights in the Middle Ages, and then he refers to specific texts about that, and then places that in a more general framework. And then so he goes then over. He makes that understandable, that the life of a knight, typical life of a medieval knight, by placing it in that broader framework. Yeah. And that was really very informative. Yeah.
And you were very fortunate to have met. I never met Elias in person. What were your recollections of him, meeting him for the first time, or being lectured by him?
As I said, my first encounter was when he gave a lecture as a guest professor. I was not immediately impressed. I saw there a small man talking in a very enthusiastic way. I liked it. I liked the way he talked and very involved, you know, and with gestures and I liked it. But it took time for me to really understand what he had to say. So, and that therefore the reading of the civilizing process was essential actually.
Yeah.
So it was indeed afterwards that I began to appreciate also what he had to say more. Let's say.
Yeah.
And also, but it struck me also. I mean, he gave a seminar in which he presented his ideas about the sociology of knowledge, and then he also said, "Well, this is quite interesting, yeah." But because he had a kind of modest way, you know, he was very intense, he was very involved, but he was also he was not arrogant.
Yeah. He
was not arrogant at all. So well. And because I didn't know anything, I met there an old man speaking English with a German accent, and so I said, well, this is nice, a nice older man, so something like that, you know. And so it took time before I became more impressed, so to speak. Yeah.
I mean, I always remember Eric recounting to me. And this must be different in the UK context because the civilizing process was only available in German. And in fact, I think Eric even wrote his own translation, but could read in German. He always felt that the relationship changed after he was able to have read the work in its original. Was that the same for you? Once you'd actually read the book, you were able to engage much more on the same sort of level with Elias about his ideas and understand where he was coming from.
That was really I also read, of course, what is sociology? Was ist Soziologie?
Yeah.
And I read it about the same time. I cannot remember exactly. About the same time as when I read the civilizing process, and again, that work did not make an immediate impression on me. I mean, I thought, well, what does he want to say actually? What is new about it? I couldn't grasp it completely.
Yeah.
And that was also after I had read the book on the civilizing process intensively, indeed, that I could better understand what he said, what he wrote in Was ist Soziologie, in What is Sociology. And I think now, I think it's a very fundamental book.
Yeah.
It's a very basic book about what sociology is about.
So this is the early 1970s, around.
Yeah, around 1970.
Around that time.
Yeah.
And so you said you read the civilizing process first, on the process of civilization, I should say.
Yes, of course.
And then you went on to what is sociology. So
yeah, I think so. Yeah, that was the order. Yeah.
Because I mean, a number of people have said that to me. I was always introduced to well, obviously the civilizing process first, and then what is sociology, and for me it always stood out as being a completely different vision of what constitutes sociology. But at that time, did it look like it was kind of like a blast from the past? Was it backward looking, or was it just very different? It didn't or you know, you said you didn't see the immediate significance of it.
No, because I mean that's what other people also have said. It sounds at first sight so simple, you know.
Yeah.
And then you think, well, what's so special about it?
Yeah.
I mean, of course, people are interdependent. Yes, well, of course.
So what? Yeah.
We know that.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
But I mean, so it takes time to realize that indeed, well, a lot of sociologists do not. Apparently recognize that, and of course non-sociologists even more. So indeed, yeah, because he presented in such a quite simple way actually. Very, he's a very clear style, simple style. So then that's I think one of the reasons that it's not immediately clear that this is important what he has to say.
And of course,
and it goes back to, of all people, Auguste Comte. Very classical. He says, well, we have to go back to Auguste Comte, which is also, in a way, amazing. Yeah. But very well fitting in his own program. Yeah.
Yeah. And of course, we keep pulling on that thread of interdependencies, of people who are embedded in these relationships.
Yeah.
It starts to have much more significance, right? And so how do you think that's that figurational approach has had an imprint on your sociology? How did it steer your own theorizing, your own kind of research?
Yeah, that's I cannot. It's difficult to reflect on it, but I think that in the course of time, for me, figurational sociology is just my way of thinking sociologically. Actually,
Yeah.
I cannot say, well, this is for me. It's not a special perspective. Something like, hey, we have figurational sociologists, and then you also have another perspective, something like that. I mean, it's for me, it's doing sociology, and so when I do that, I do not always think, well, what should Elias think about that? Because I hope I have internalized it in a way, and perhaps I write some things that he would not agree with. I mean, that's quite possible, of course, or other figurational sociologists. I mean, you have that kind of variation, of course, but I think basically, fundamentally, it's for me, it's just doing sociology. The notion in the need of human interdependence, the notion of that social society is always changing, and that there are regularities in those changes, that we have to investigate it, that processes are interconnected with one another. That indeed purposeful social actions of interdependent individuals produce social processes which none of those individuals has planned and can control, and so on. So the unintended consequences of interconnected social action, those kinds of general views, which to some extent has also been put forward by sometimes, from time to time, by other sociologists.
Yeah.
You know, that notion of the unintended consequences of purposeful social action has also been formulated by Robert Merton and probably others. So there is, I mean, I don't see figurational sociology as something very exclusive.
Yeah. I mean, Norbert often presents himself. He has a little bit of self-mythology, perhaps, that he kind of emerges Athena-like out of the head of Zeus. You know, he's just this kind of maverick scholar who breaks with tradition. Would you say that there's more parallels? You've mentioned Merton and certain others. I mean,
Well, there is perhaps a kind of of tension between it, because Norbert also said that the development of human knowledge is always an interaction, succession of scholars, of individuals who all contribute to it. And the knowledge is chains of knowledge. You have to speak of chains of knowledge. Yeah. So no individual produces completely new knowledge. Yeah. So he considered himself also as being part of a chain, so to speak. That was, but on the other hand, that's something for which Elias has been criticized, that he does not refer very often to previous social scientists or scholars who have formulated similar things. That's I see that he could have referred more to predecessors, indeed. Yeah.
But this imagery of chains of knowledge and the baton relay race and the intergenerational passing on of the torch. How much of a part of that were you? Because obviously this is still, was it relatively early in the establishment of figurational sociology in the Netherlands? The early 70s wasn't fully established at this stage, or was it?
No, okay. No, of course. I have experienced the start, so to speak, of a school. It started, I think, predominantly in Amsterdam. Yeah. And of course, the most important person who did that was Joop Goudsblom, who was then professor in sociology and recognized the enormous importance of Elias's work for sociology in general. I mean, it was also the time of many conflicting schools of sociology, big tensions, and so on. What was called the crisis of sociology, the crisis that, well, there were so many different theories, and all those theories and theory groups, were in enormous conflicts with one another. Marxism on the other hand, and the other micro sociologies on the other hand, and then Goudsblom recognized in the work of Elias, a way to supersede those different theoretical perspectives and see figurational sociology as a more comprehensive perspective, actually. And I think he was quite right in that.
And did you align with that? Did you feel?
As I said, it took some time. It was not that when Goudsblom said that, and I was not immediately completely convinced. And it really took time. But I was slowly. The impact of Joop Goudsblom was quite important for that, I think, because I had quite a strong relation with him, and he was my PhD supervisor, for example. And, so we had a lot of talks, and that had an influence on me. In the course of time.
So it's not just Elias himself; it's also Joop. It's
that was
time.
And then Bram de Zwaan became also professor, and he also, under the impact of Joop, also started to work with Elias's ideas. His work on the welfare state, for example, is very much under the impact of figurational analysis, actually. But in a somewhat different way, and I also had that influence from Bram de Zwaan, for example.
And how big an impact did Norbert have in Amsterdam around this time? And was it? I mean, Dick Pels, for example, has referred to it as being almost like a closed shop, eventually becoming a closed shop. It was figurational sociology, and to the exclusion of everything else.
No, well, there was indeed. There was a very clear group formation around Joop Goudsblom, and more indirectly Norbert himself, of course, and Bram de Zwaan, and that was a clear group formation of people who indeed worked with figurational sociology, indeed. Although not all of them said, I'm in figurational sociology, but they worked with this insight, they were sympathetic about it, and so on. And indeed, that evoked also a lot of criticism. So there was then a kind of idea that this is a closed sect, a kind of religious sect with one guru, Norbert Elias, and one prophet, Joop Goudsblom, let's say.
And was it like that?
No, not according to our definition. We said, no, we are a very open group. We want to discuss everything. I mean, of course. I mean, when you have an interesting idea, come along. We can discuss it. You know.
Yeah. But so it was open. It was inclusive. It wasn't.
No. It was not dogmatic. I mean that was the idea. That it was not dogmatic at all. I mean, because that's not. I think that's not indeed a way to do sociology, and of course not. I mean, it's not doing good sociology in any way. But I mean, it was there were also a lot of discussions, within that group. For example, about the relevance of the theory of the civilizing process for recent developments, for recent changes in interaction styles. So the question how to interpret the breaking of taboos in the 1960s and 1970s in view of the theory of the civilizing process. Mm-hmm. Is the civilizing process continuing in the same direction, or is it a fundamental change? And then, of course, Cas Wouters came with his idea of informalization, which was also then got positive stamp of Elias himself. He said, well, I also think that there is an informalization process going on, which means actually that the civilizing process is indeed continuing in the sense that that informalization requires more self-control, to say it very shortly. Mm-hmm. But that was discussed. I mean, there were people who disagreed with that. To say, well, no, you cannot say that. So there was quite a discussion about it, and yeah.
And the discussion wasn't just within the academy, was it? I mean, Elias was becoming quite rapidly what we would now call a public sociologist. Is that right?
Yes, in the Netherlands he became quite well known indeed. Yes, because that had to do also with that group formation, I think. So there were journalists who wrote about that and said, well, there's something going on there. Yeah. And sometimes they were critical, you know. They said, well, this is a strange movement here going on and so on. But then, of course, other people responded on that, and there were some people who had quite an well. It had also to do with the fact that some people within that group wrote in newspapers or wrote in intellectual journals, for example. For example, Godfried van Bent van den Berg, who was also a journalist for a while. Bram de Zwaan, who was editor of De Gids, which was a kind of intellectual journal. A monthly review, actually, quite prestigious. So that made also and some translated work of Norbert Elias was published in that general review.
For there was a different tradition in Netherlands, I think. Even a different tradition in the Netherlands that persists even a little bit now.
Yes.
That we've lost in the UK, for example, around. Much more the two-way traffic between the academy, between journalists.
Yes.
Public debates, sociological ideas being discussed in public forums much more.
Yeah.
So, I just want to ask a little bit more about your relationship with Norbert and how well you came to know him and in what sort of capacity.
I was indeed in that circle, so to speak, and so I got to know Norbert himself also quite well, but not. I mean, it was. I cannot say I was a friend or something like that, but I knew him and he knew me, and he was always very friendly and interested in my work, and so we were. That was indeed very nice, but of course he became quite old at the time. Yeah. Now I can remember that I gave when I finished my PhD dissertation, and it was quite a big book. And then I visited him, and I said, "Well, here I have the book. You have a look." And then he said, "You give it to me?" And then I said, "Yes, I gave it to you." So that was a nice memory, and well, I had some discussions with him when he lived in Amsterdam, and
And what did he make of your thesis? Did he ever give you any feedback on the thesis?
Well, he read my my thesis was in Dutch, so he couldn't read it, but he read the English summary,
okay.
And he said that it was. He found it very, very interesting and good. And before I had a few conversations with him about my plans for the PhD thesis, which were helpful indeed. Yeah.
So you'd already had a steer over the thesis, and also indirectly through Joop had some influence over the direction of the thesis. And
yes. Yeah.
And what would you say is the kind of the most important aspects of his work? What's his kind of intellectual legacy in the Netherlands and more generally?
Well, that's difficult to say. Well, I said already a few things about it. I think indeed his work provides basic foundations for how to do sociology.
Yeah.
And of course, you can elaborate it in very different ways. But so in that sense, it's very open. But I think well, to put it in one sentence, I think that this is the most important legacy.
Yeah. And yet, since then, there have been perhaps fewer people engaging with his work. I can think of a handful still now at UVA who are still actively engaging seriously with Elias's work. How would you account for that sort of waning of his influence in Amsterdam, if I have that correct?
Yes, that you can say that there's not anymore, let's say, a clear group around figurational sociology.
Yeah.
But I think that has also to do with the fact that there are not anymore such outspoken theory groups like you had in the 1970s. You know, that people were organized, let's say, around theoretical perspectives.
Yeah.
So people now are more flexible, more eclectic, and they define themselves as not belonging to a certain theory or certain perspective, but they pick up what they think is useful. Mm-hmm. At least that's the tendency in the Netherlands.
Yeah.
Most people do just empirical work and then think, well, what can I use from the available theories for explaining that? And in that sense, I think figuration sociology, Elias' theory of civilization is still quite often used.
Yeah.
Often also combined with, for example, Bourdieu's work and so on, which is now also quite influential. And I think that combination is quite possible.
Yeah, yeah.
So I'm not that pessimistic. I mean, yesterday there was someone who presented a paper and he said there are three phases in group formation. You know, the first phase is the phase of the founder, so to speak, and then you have the phase of the group which is forming, and then you have the phase of kind of diffusion of the influence. And as a consequence, the group started to dissolve in a way. So you could also say, in an optimistic interpretation, you could say we are now in the Netherlands. We are now perhaps in the third phase, but not enough, I would say. I mean.